This ends here!
They said he was worth $3,000. That's what the auctioneer shouted in the Milledgeville Market Square that scorching August morning in 1847, when Isaiah Freeman, called Zeke by those who dared speak to him, stood on the platform with iron shackles that looked like children's bracelets on his wrists, 7 feet and 7 inches of muscle and bone, hands that could palm a man's head like an apple, shoulders that blocked the sun, $3,000, and not a single bid. Thomas Blackwood watched from the shade of his carriage, a thin smile cutting across his face. He'd heard about this one. 6 owners in 5 years, each one selling at a loss, each one whispering the same things. Won't be broken, won't bend. Something wrong behind those eyes. The other planters called Zeke a bad investment. Blackwood called him an opportunity. $200, Blackwood said, his voice cutting through the awkward silence. The auctioneer blinked. Sir, I said I heard what you said. I'm telling you what he's worth, $200 for a Negro nobody can use. Blackwood stood, straightening his jacket. Unless someone here thinks they can do better than the 6 men who already failed. Silence. The kind that feels like agreement. Sold then. To Mr. Blackwood. Zeke's eyes found Blackwood's across the square. Didn't look down. Didn't look away. Just held the gaze until Blackwood felt something cold touch his spine despite the heat. The planter told himself it was anticipation. He was lying to himself already, and he didn't know it yet. The Blackwood plantation sat 12 miles southwest of Milledgeville, 300 acres of cotton that made Thomas Blackwood one of the wealthiest men in Baldwin County. He'd built his fortune on a reputation, the man who could break anyone. Runaways came back obedient. Rebels learned silence. Women who fought learned stillness. He had methods, and those methods had never failed. Zeke arrived on a Thursday. Blackwood assembled the other 43 enslaved people in the yard, as he always did with new acquisitions. Establish hierarchy early. Make the lesson public. This is Zeke, Blackwood announced, walking a slow circle around the giant. Some of you might have heard stories. 6 masters couldn't handle him. 6 masters were weak. He stopped, looking up at Zeke's face. I am not weak. In 90 days, he'll be just another field hand. Obedient, useful, broken. Zeke said nothing. Didn't look at Blackwood. Looked at the others instead. A long, slow sweep of his gaze across faces that ranged from curious to pitying to afraid. An old woman named Ruth caught his eye and gave the smallest shake of her head. A warning. He blinked once. Acknowledgement. Take him to the North Field, Blackwood told his overseer, a Pennsylvania man named Hutchins who'd come south for the wages. Standard work. Let's see what he's got. What happened over the next 90 days would become legend in 3 counties, though the white people who told the story could never quite explain what actually occurred. Zeke worked. That was the problem, in a way. He did exactly what was asked. When Hutchins said pick cotton, Zeke picked cotton. When told to move timber, he moved timber. Carry water, he carried water. His output exceeded 3 normal men. By every measurable standard, Blackwood had acquired the most productive laborer in Georgia, but something was wrong. Hutchins felt it first. He'd supervised hundreds of enslaved workers over 15 years, developed instincts for trouble. Zeke set off every instinct, yet Hutchins couldn't articulate why. The giant never disobeyed, never talked back, never showed defiance in any way the overseer could name. He looks at me wrong, Hutchins finally said to Blackwood, 3 weeks in. Then stop looking at him. You don't understand, Hutchins struggled for words. He don't move right, too quiet for a man that size. I'll be checking the water barrels and suddenly he's just there, 10 feet away, and I never heard him coming. You want me to punish a Negro for walking quietly? He stares, Mr. Blackwood, direct-like. Don't drop his eyes when I look back. Blackwood had encountered this complaint before with Zeke's previous owners. It was always about the eyes, the way he moved, the feeling he created. Nothing concrete, nothing actionable, just unease. 30 days down, Blackwood said. 60 to go. He's working, isn't he? Yes, sir. Then there's no problem. But there was. Blackwood felt it himself when he rode out to inspect the fields that afternoon. Zeke was hauling cut timber, a beam across his shoulders that should have required 2 men. He moved with mechanical efficiency, placing each log precisely where indicated. Perfect obedience. Yet when Blackwood rode close, intending to observe, Zeke turned his head, looked directly at him. Not up at him, Blackwood was mounted, but somehow still the impression was that Zeke looked down. The horse shifted nervously. Blackwood opened his mouth to speak, to assert something, anything, but found he'd forgotten what he meant to say. Zeke held the gaze for exactly 3 seconds, then returned to work as if nothing had happened. Blackwood rode back to the house with his jaw clenched tight. That evening, he drank more whiskey than usual. The other enslaved people noticed. Hard not to notice a man who made overseers go quiet, who walked through the quarters after dark like a shadow despite his size. Ruth, who'd lived long enough to see patterns, watched Zeke with something between concern and hope. "You're playing a dangerous game," she said one night when he came to draw water from the well. "Not playing." His voice was surprisingly soft, like distant thunder. "Playing means you might lose. They catch you at whatever you're doing. They'll kill you slow." "They catch me doing what?" "Working hard, following orders." He lifted the bucket, 30 gallons that 2 men struggled with, like it weighed nothing. Can't punish a man for being obedient. Can punish him for making white folks uncomfortable. Zeke's smile was a rare thing, quick and gone. Making them uncomfortable is the point. He was doing it deliberately. Ruth understood then, the silent approach, the direct gazes, the way he somehow always appeared in doorways at exactly the moment someone was discussing him, the perfect, literal obedience that still felt like mockery. He was following every rule while breaking the most important invisible one. He refused to be diminished. 45 days in, a field hand named Simon collapsed from heat exhaustion. Hutchins was raising his whip to motivate Simon back to his feet when Zeke simply stepped between them, said nothing, did nothing, just stood there, 7.5 feet of presence, looking down at Hutchins with those steady eyes. "Move aside," Hutchins said, voice tight. Zeke reached down, slowly, so slowly that Hutchins had time to object but somehow couldn't find words, and lifted Simon like a child, carried him to the shade, set him down gently, returned to his position in the field. "I told you to," Hutchins started. "You said work the field, sir." Zeke's tone was perfect deference, empty of anything Hutchins could call insubordination. "I'm working." But Simon stayed in the shade, and Hutchins didn't push it. Couldn't explain why, even to himself. Just something about the way Zeke had moved, the deliberateness of it, the silent message that pushing further would take them somewhere the overseer didn't want to go. That night, Hutchins requested a transfer to a different plantation. Blackwood denied it. Couldn't afford the reputation hit of losing an overseer over a single Negro, even an unusual one. 60 days arrived with autumn's first coolness. Blackwood threw a dinner party, partly business, partly a declaration. Invited fellow planters, the county judge, a state legislator visiting from Savannah. The unspoken agenda, demonstrate his success. Look at me, breaking the unbreakable. 90 days was approaching, and Zeke was still working, still obedient, still generating profit. "You've got him trained well," Judge Milton observed over pre-dinner bourbon. "Heard he was impossible." "There's no such thing as impossible," Blackwood said. "Just men too weak to impose their will properly." "I'll believe it when I see him." "You'll see him tonight, he's serving." Something flickered across Milton's face. "You sure that's wise? Man that size, that close to—" "He's domesticated," Blackwood interrupted, "like any other." But he'd hesitated before giving that order to the house servants, thought about keeping Zeke in the fields where he belonged, then decided against it. The whole point was proving dominance. Having Zeke serve dinner to the men who'd whispered that Blackwood couldn't control him, that was the ultimate demonstration. The dining room gleamed with silver and crystal. 8 men in fine suits seated around walnut that cost more than most people earned in a year. Conversation flowed easily. Cotton futures, the political situation, problems with abolitionists up north. Blackwood's wife Martha supervised from the doorway as 3 house servants brought out the first course. Then Zeke entered carrying a tureen of soup. The conversation stopped, not slowly, not trailing off. Stopped like someone had severed it with a blade. Zeke moved around the table, serving each guest with perfect formal technique. Ladle held correctly, portions precisely measured, movements smooth and professional. He'd been trained for this by some previous owner, Blackwood realized. Everything about his service was textbook correct, everything except his presence. The dining room suddenly felt smaller, the ceiling lower. Zeke didn't hurry, didn't make noise, didn't do anything that could be criticized, but his height made him loom over each seated man. When he reached across someone to place a bowl, his arm seemed to hover like a threat despite its steadiness, and his face, expressionless, neutral, eyes focused on his task, somehow conveyed more threat than any glare. Judge Milton stared down at his soup and didn't lift his spoon. "Excellent presentation," someone said weakly. Zeke retreated to the wall, standing at attention as house servants were trained to do, hands behind his back, eyes forward, ready to serve the next course. The conversation resumed, strained now, quieter, with long pauses. Men kept glancing toward where Zeke stood, kept losing their train of thought. The legislator from Savannah asked about cotton yields, and Blackwood answered, but both men's eyes drifted to the giant figure standing motionless in the shadows. When Zeke stepped forward to serve the second course, someone's fork clattered against china. The sound seemed obscenely loud. "Perhaps," Martha ventured from the doorway, "we should have Jenny finish serving." "No need," Blackwood said too sharply. "Zeke is perfectly capable." He was. That was the horror of it, Blackwood was beginning to realize. Zeke performed flawlessly, but his perfection was worse than incompetence would have been. Each movement, each moment of standing still, each time he leaned across the table, all technically correct, all somehow terrifying in a way none of the white men could articulate. Halfway through the main course, the judge excused himself, didn't return for 15 minutes. The legislator drank 3 glasses of wine in quick succession. Another guest started a story about a horse race, lost his place twice, gave up. Zeke said nothing, did nothing wrong, simply existed in the room with perfect obedience and devastating effect. When the dinner finally, mercifully ended, guests departed faster than courtesy normally allowed, made excuses about early mornings, long rides home, business to attend. They thanked Martha for her hospitality and congratulated Blackwood on his, they struggled for words, on his successful management. Judge Milton paused at the door. "Thomas, a word." They stepped onto the porch. Night had brought genuine cold, stars sharp overhead. "That Negro," Milton started, "is perfectly trained. You saw. I saw a room full of white men made uncomfortable in their own skin." The judge kept his voice low. "I saw something that shouldn't be kept close to people. That size, that presence. There's something wrong about it. He follows every order." "That's not the point, and you know it." Milton looked back through the window where Zeke was clearing the table with mechanical precision. "A dog can be obedient and still dangerous, can still have something broken inside that makes it unpredictable. That's not a success story, Thomas. That's a powder keg pretending to be domesticated." After the judge left, Blackwood poured himself whiskey and sat in his study. He could hear Zeke moving through the house, completing his duties. Footsteps that shouldn't be so quiet, presence that shouldn't fill space like water finding every crack. 87 days, 3 to go. 3 days until he'd proven his point, won his reputation, demonstrated that no Negro, regardless of size or strangeness, was beyond his control. But sitting alone with amber liquid and failing lamplight, Thomas Blackwood knew the truth that Judge Milton had seen clearly. He hadn't won anything. Zeke worked because Zeke chose to work. Obeyed because obedience itself had become a weapon. Every perfect action was a reminder that Blackwood hadn't broken him, couldn't break him, because there was nothing to break. Zeke had simply found a way to be free while still wearing chains. 90 days arrived on a Saturday. Blackwood held another gathering, smaller this time, just close neighbors, a few business associates, a quiet celebration of success, proof that his methods worked even on the impossible cases. Zeke served lunch with the same flawless, disturbing perfection. Blackwood watched his guests' faces, saw the discomfort, the way eyes tracked Zeke's movements, the way conversations stuttered, watched, and finally understood what 6 previous owners had learned. You could own a man's body, could dictate his actions, his time, his labor, could buy and sell him like furniture. But if that man refused, truly fundamentally refused, to accept his own diminishment, then all the legal ownership in the world meant nothing. Zeke had turned his enslavement into theater, a daily performance where his perfect obedience highlighted the moral obscenity of requiring it. Every "yes, sir" contained an invisible, "but you know and I know this is absurd." Every completed task said, "I'm doing this because you asked, not because you compelled." The guests left. Martha retreated to her room with a headache. The other enslaved people finished their work and disappeared into the quarters, giving Zeke wide berth, as they always did. though whether from fear or respect, none could say. As darkness fell, Blackwood stood on his porch and watched Zeke complete evening chores with mechanical precision. The giant moved from barn to well to tool shed, checking things, securing things, preparing the estate for night. Then, as Blackwood watched, Zeke simply walked to the main gate, opened it, stepped through, and kept walking down the road toward the black line of trees. Blackwood's hand went to the bell that would summon the overseer, the dogs, the chase. Stopped. Because what would he say? Zeke escaped. The 7.5-foot Negro that everyone in 3 counties knew about just walked away. And what? Nobody noticed. They'd laugh. They'd know the truth, that Blackwood had been too frightened to stop him. He watched Zeke's silhouette shrink into the darkness, watched until it disappeared completely. Then he went inside, poured whiskey, and tried to convince himself it was better this way. Let the giant be someone else's problem. He'd proven his point anyway. 90 days of productive work. That's what he'd tell people. Nobody believed it. Word spread quickly. The giant of Georgia had walked off Blackwood's land, and Blackwood had watched him go. Within a month, 3 neighboring planters quietly sold their difficult enslaved workers to buyers in Alabama, afraid that word of Zeke's departure might give others ideas. Within 6 months, Blackwood's reputation as the man who could break anyone had curdled into whispers that he'd been broken himself. The plantation never recovered. Not financially. The numbers were fine. But something had shifted in the quarters. The other enslaved people worked with the same mechanical perfection Zeke had demonstrated, that same technically correct obedience that still felt like mockery. Hutchins quit. The replacement overseer lasted 3 months. Martha moved to Savannah, citing health concerns. 2 years later, Blackwood sold everything and moved to Charleston, told people he was diversifying his interests. Everyone knew the truth. The giant of Georgia had won without raising a fist. As for Zeke himself, the records go strange. Nothing official, no capture, no sale, no death certificate, but stories multiplied. A giant Negro spotted helping runaways near the Oconee River, an impossibly tall figure leading a group of escapees through swampland near the Florida border, a man matching his description working as a stevedore in a free port, using a different name, living in plain sight, because nobody could quite believe what they were seeing. Ruth, who lived to see emancipation in 1865, told one story over and over in her final years, said that 3 weeks after Zeke left, a young man named Daniel tried to run, got caught within a day, brought back to face punishment. The entire plantation was assembled to watch, to learn, to be reminded of the cost of defiance. Daniel stood there shaking, 14 years old, knowing what came next. The overseer raised his whip. Then every single person in that yard looked up, together, simultaneous, as if pulled by the same string. There was nothing there. No one in the trees, no figure watching, just the feeling, unmistakable, undeniable, of being observed, of something vast and silent and patient, tracking every movement. The overseer lowered his whip, told Daniel to get back to work, never explained why. Ruth swore she knew, said Zeke had figured out something the rest of them were still learning, that true freedom wasn't about escaping chains. It was about refusing, in your mind and bones and spirit, to be enslaved at all. It was about making your oppressor understand without words that they could control your body, but they'd never own you. That every order they gave was proof of their weakness, not their power. He didn't need to be there in that yard, Ruth said. He was there anyway, in the overseer's hesitation, in Daniel's spine straightening up, in the air itself, because he'd shown us all something we couldn't unsee, that freedom is something you claim, not something they give. The last confirmed sighting came in 1872, 7 years after the war ended. A journalist in Atlanta interviewed an elderly black man about his experiences with the Underground Railroad. The man mentioned, almost as an aside, that the most effective conductors were often the most visible, people who were so obviously unusual that whites couldn't process what they were seeing. Biggest man I ever knew, he said, had a theory about it. Said if you're already impossible, might as well use it. Said fear is a tool, and the people who built this whole system on fear ain't ready for it being used against them. You mean Henry Box Brown, the journalist asked, referencing the famous escapee, or Anthony Burns? No, sir. Man I knew went by Zeke, 7.5 feet if he was an inch, eyes that looked right through you to the truth underneath. The old man smiled. Heard he helped dozens get north, maybe hundreds. Guards would see him walking with a group and their brains just couldn't make sense of it. Too strange, too big, too calm. So they'd look away, and by the time they looked back, everyone was gone. Is he still alive? Don't rightly know, man like that, though. I figure he could be anywhere, could be everywhere, could be watching right now. The old man's smile widened. That was his genius, see? He understood that once you get in someone's head, you never really leave. Blackwood spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. Probably still is, wherever he ended up. I think he's watching from beyond the grave. I think some people are so free, so completely and utterly free, that even death is just another master they refuse to obey. The journalist didn't include that quote in his final article, considered it too fanciful, too mythological, but he never forgot it. Years later, dying in a hospital in 1903, he told his daughter about the giant who'd turned his enslavement into theater, who'd walked away from a plantation because staying was no longer interesting, who'd built a legend on nothing but presence and refusal. Was it true, she asked. Don't know, but I hope so. He closed his eyes. God, I hope so. In Baldwin County, Georgia, they stopped talking about Zeke by the 1880s. Too uncomfortable, too close to questions people didn't want to answer. But every now and then, someone clearing land would find things. Massive boot prints preserved in old mud, now hard as stone. A doorframe on an abandoned plantation reinforced at 8 feet high for no discernible reason. A grave marker, weathered and anonymous, that simply read giant with no dates, no name, no explanation. And sometimes late at night when the pines whisper and shadows stretch long, people swear they feel it. That presence, that vast and patient silence that says, I see you, I know what you are, and you don't frighten me. A reminder that the most terrifying thing for those who deal in human bondage isn't violence. It's meeting someone who simply refuses to be bound.